Hello, and you are listening to EcoJustice Radio on KPFK Los Angeles and KPFT Houston. A project of SoCal 350 Climate Action, our show presents environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame, featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Welcome, I am Jack Eit. On today's show, the Wild Yards Project Transforming Lawns into Biodiverse Habitats, host Carrie Kim will be interviewing David Newsom, founder of the Wild Yards Project. The Wild Yards Project is an organization whose mission is to transform urban and suburban cultivated spaces into more biodiverse, more resilient, and more equitable spaces by centering the use of native plants, native stewardship, and compassion. With over 25 years in film and television, David combines storytelling, community outreach, and on-site consultation and installations to inspire globally, transform built spaces locally, and provide the resources for people everywhere to begin restoring and healing the land where they live and work.
Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, thank you for tuning in to hear from David Newsom, founder of the Wild Yards Project today. We want to thank first the Tongva ancestors for their enduring presence, legacy, and stewardship of this area. Our show comes to you from the ancestral homelands of the Tongva, and we invite you to align with and support local First Nations and their homelands wherever you live. Our times are demanding that we reconnect to nature and the place where we live. If we've learned anything from the last couple years, it is that nothing lasts forever. We've been covering the sixth great extinction in various ways and the urgency of supporting native habitat in recent episodes. The World Wildlife Fund recently announced that we are losing 10,000 species a year to extinction, primarily due to habitat loss. Meanwhile, the U.S. has turned over 40 million acres of native habitat into high-maintenance, lifeless, and also toxic lawns. According to Beyond Pesticides, suburban lawns and gardens receive more pesticides per acre than in agriculture, to the tune of 90 million pounds per year. Regrettably, many people are now turning also to fake grass or synthetic lawns for instant green gratification, to reduce water usage, and for the convenience. However, all of this can be costly over the lifespan of the synthetic lawn and potentially include harmful ingredients, including microplastics or recycled tires, and they inhibit biodiversity. Regardless, all lawns can be reclaimed, regenerated, and repurposed into habitat where the tens of thousands of displaced, native, and threatened species could once again thrive. Combining award-winning filmmakers, esteemed botanists, biologists, and native plant landscapers, the Wild Yards Project is here to remind us that one yard can save a species, but many yards can transform the world. Many, many thanks, David, for joining us on the show today.
It's really fun to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for your perseverance in getting here. Listeners, David is coming to us from the East Coast. He can speak a little bit more about that, but let's start at the beginning. You and your wife, both artists, come from long careers in film and TV. If you could tell us about the pivotal moment when the two of you decided to repurpose your life and work back to nature.
Well, there's two. Well, I mean, I guess there's many, but as a team, when we were pregnant, when my wife was pregnant, we were looking for a place to live. We didn't own a home. And so we ended up in Northeast LA in a house in Eagle Rock, which is sort of in Northeast LA between Pasadena and Glendale. And we literally lived about, I guess maybe 75 feet from a very busy 4-lane boulevard. We looked at the house and it was going to be fine. It would fit us. It's not a big house at all, but it would be fine. But we looked at the backyard and it was just a really ruined lot. It was a dead lot of upturned. I don't know. To be honest, I even when I looked at it, I really didn't understand what I was looking at. But somebody had tried to do something and then they had decided not to do that. And then they had just turned everything up into garbage and thrown a bunch of garbage back there. And I had this memory, I had this sudden sense of urgency that my kids, wouldn't have the kind of interaction with wildlife that I had, even as a kid growing up in developing New Jersey. I grew up in post-World War II New Jersey, and I grew up with tract homes up against tertiary and secondary forests, old farms that had been gone fallow and have been overgrown with oak and maple and elms and things like that. And so even though I lived in these tract, developments, I could jump over a cyclone fence and be in a version of wilderness, my version, my baseline experience of wilderness. And there were box turtles and salamanders, marble salamanders, dusky salamanders, spotted salamanders. There were wood frogs and pickerel frogs, and there were still streams and things like that. Mm-hmm. And by the way, all those things were all gone. But I had that, I had that experience of nature. And so when we were pregnant and living in Los Angeles, we suddenly realized that wasn't going to happen. And all I wanted to do, and all I knew that I wanted to do, was to try and find some way to give them that, so that when they walked out the door, there'd be some experience of a green world and a biodiverse world. And I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about gardening. Nothing. I'd been an avid outdoorsman my whole life, but I now reel at the fact that I considered myself an avid outdoorsman, but I really didn't know anything. I didn't know anything of this coastal sage scrub, this spectacular gem of an ecosystem that surrounded me in Los Angeles. I knew I relied on it for my sanity, but I didn't know it. And I didn't know the history of it. And I didn't know the history of Los Angeles. I knew nothing. And if I hadn't had a desire to create a biodiverse space in my backyard, I probably wouldn't have learned about the social, political, and biological history of my city the way that I have now. But that was the inciting incident. The inciting incident was the pregnancy of my wife, right, and wanting my kids to have something.
Well, that intergenerational piece of wanting to, be working for the future generations is natural, right? That's sort of how we originally would have existed. It's always about passing on what we had experienced or the best for the next generation, and we would do well to continue doing that. So when you began Wild Yards, you told us that you didn't have any prior background. So could you tell us, about plants, and really other than, having grown up around plants, but you were not a gardener or a farmer or any of these other things. So if you could tell us a little bit about that learning curve for yourself. It'd probably take you some time to tell that story, but.
So I think the first thing that I did was I did what I think a lot of people do. And I was like, oh, well, pollinators, right? So I'll have pollinator plants. And so I went to the local commercial nursery and I went to their pollinator plant section and I bought pollinator plants, right? And I put those pollinator plants in the ground, not even remotely aware that they were from South America and South Africa and Australia and all those other places, which there's a reason for that. There's reasons for all those plants existing in our lives and in our sort of horticultural lexicon. But all I'm going to say is, just to start with, I didn't know where they were from. I just thought, okay, I want butterflies and I want bees in my yard. And so I put these things in the ground. But I come from film and television and photography. So I took pictures of them and then I would do homework. I would try and figure out what were the things on the plants. And having produced documentary television for a long time, I would also call my instinct was always find the people who know the most about this stuff. So I called people who wrote books and I called people who ran gardens, like Carol Bornstein, who has written some of the seminal books on horticulture with California native plants, and Nicholas Hummingbird.
Yeah.
Well, she's on the advisory board, but she also created the gardens at the Museum of Natural History in Los Angeles, which is a 3-acre series of native ecosystems that is to me, one of the best places to learn about native plants in Los Angeles.
Can you repeat the name of that place again?
It's the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, and it's their habitat ecosystems that they've built. Carol, in collaboration with Mia Lara and many other people, they built a 3-acre in what was formerly a parking lot in the middle of downtown Los Angeles. They built a series of native ecosystems that are robust and extremely biodiverse and have a lot of wildlife in them, much of which is utterly inexplicable how it got there, and really takes the whole "if you build it, they will come" concept to a giant extreme. But anyway, I introduced myself to her, and I just started, learning more and more about it. And the first thing when I started photographing the plants and posting it just as David Newsom, on Instagram, like to my friends, people wanted to know what I was doing and why I was doing it. But then I also started learning more. Like people would also there'd be feedback. You get into this kind of like feedback loop, and people are like, oh, if you use native plants, you might have more native bees. And I was like, what's a native bee? Like, I didn't know anything.
Right.
I didn't
You're
know
going
anything.
down the
I was
rabbit
like, bees. They're bees. You got bees, right? Well, you think of bees, you think of like a honeybee, and you think of like, I didn't know honeybees weren't native. I didn't know that they were from Europe or they were Africanized or any of that stuff. So the more I learned, then the more curious I became, and I just kept reaching out and just kept expanding exponentially. And I just kept wanting to know more and more and try to understand what indigeneity had to do with biodiversity. And that sort of led me down the rabbit hole.
Well, I should backtrack a little bit for listeners to tell them a little bit about the vision of Wild Yards Project and what you actually do. So if you could explain about transforming urban and suburban cultivated spaces and why you're doing that and what is the end goal of that. If you could speak a little bit more about the vision and mission of the Wild Yards Project.
Sure. So when I was writing as myself, sort of just on Instagram and posting, it just, the level of interest from a lot of people from, it's kind of from my community, film and television and stuff like that, they just weren't aware of it. And I really wasn't aware of it either. I have no hubris in any of this. Like I came in utterly ignorant, and I just started learning and sharing what I learned. And then I just kept seeking more and more information from other people. But at a certain point, it snowballed to the point where I thought, I got to call this something else. Like I've got to bifurcate me. And I messed around and came up with different things to call it. And then I just called it the Wild Yards Project. And I gave it its own place to live. I gave it a website. I gave it its Instagram handle. And it really snowballed from there a great deal. And my original idea was to, as I was meeting people, I want to just keep interviewing them. If I was going to interview them and like photograph it and publish it on the website, or if I was just going to do a post about them on Instagram, I just wanted to understand as much as I could and share what I understood or what I learned as I learned it. And that became the fundamental basis for the Wild Yards Project, which was the goal being to transform our built spaces back into indigenous habitat, public and private spaces. And that was it. And to then figure out how we do that and to always kind of share what I was learning, my successes and failures with people, but also share the people that I was meeting along the way with everybody else. And then as my website evolved, I realized that people didn't have a go-to place to find all this stuff. And I didn't have the money. I didn't have the bandwidth to sort of do the slick kind of robust website that I would like to have done, but I did it anyway. I created a database, a national database using like a open source Google software to kind of create a map for nurseries and landscapers who are doing this work across the United States. I started reaching out to people and saying like, hey, would you become an advisor to me? And that was really it. I mean, I really started it with a great deal of energy and enthusiasm and an enormous amount of ignorance.
But then maybe that was because you didn't know where it was going to lead and it just led you.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I met with when I was working on a TV series a long time ago, I was meeting with all these gurus from India. Mm-hmm. And there was one woman, she said, if you do one thing well enough, you will learn everything about the universe. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that just going down this rabbit hole of trying to create biodiverse ecosystems where you live has been an enormous teacher for me, not just about horticulture and botany and beyond horticulture, but also about our history and about, my history as a white European descendant and the role that my ancestors and me that I have played in where we are now. And anyway, so, we can unpack all that. But,
that part of wanting to explore and understand more of your cultural heritage, was that a natural extension of going back to the land where you are, that it just started to continue connecting you more and more to your ancestral roots, like wanting to know more about that? Was that an extension of you being more connected to the lands, period, in that?
No. There's no elegant way for me to articulate this because it might be the first time I'm having this conversation. But my goal was so simple. I'm like, hey, if you got a yard, it should be wild. You know what I mean? Like, right. You got a yard. You even made a comment to me, prior about, like how I said, and it makes your, in my little movie on the homepage of the Wild Yards Project, I said, and it makes your property value go up. When I started doing this stuff, I was like, well, how do I make the average person give up about this? Because I do know from making television that when you talk about environmental issues, your ratings go down. I work
people tune out.
I worked for Discovery, Planet Green. I've worked for a bunch of different, I've worked on shows, and it's very hard. It's very hard to bring those things. It's very hard to bring unless there's some way to make it entertaining and things like that. And so I was like, well, what are some fundamental, simple things? Anyway, so that was one of the things that I said. And now when I hear that, I kind of cringe, but that was really a very simple, way I thought I could get people's attention with this. And of course, now it's like, well, who even gets to own a lawn? You know what I mean? We talk about land ownership. And so, for me, as we used to say, all art is politics. All plants is politics. The whole idea of horticulture is deeply political. And so that's been a layer of my education in this pursuit of helping to make, built systems more biodiverse has been that. So that came from just my interest in wanting to do this. I always considered myself, a liberal progressive, but I found that to be a very wanting self. Believe me, there's a million directions to go in this conversation, but it has been an endlessly unfolding understanding of how we got to be where we are. You cannot look at how the land is or have a conversation about a heal land and not go down all of these roads.
David, hold that thought, and we will come right back to speak more about your journey with the Wild Yards Project, which you founded.
Sure. Okay.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying EcoJustice Radio. We air every Monday at 9 a.m. on KPFT Houston and Wednesday at 3 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles. Stay connected by subscribing to EcoJustice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today, you are listening to the Wild Yards Project, transforming lawns into biodiverse habitats, with host Carrie Kim and guest David Newsom, founder of the Wild Yards Project.
Listeners, we're back with David Newsom, founder of the Wild Yards Project, and we were just discussing the exploration and inquiry into your cultural heritage and how that is also connected with your own reconnection to the land and your own journey in connecting other people to land and the ecosystems of which we are a part. So one of the things you mentioned in your mission statement with Wild Yards is that Wild Yards Project is committed to native gardens and native stewardship. I'm wondering what you mean by native stewardship.
When I started having those conversations, I don't think I really even understood the implications of those conversations. And even when I use that word now, I feel like I'm using a word that I have to step lightly around. But what's very clear to me is that you can't, if you're going to talk about restoring native ecosystems, then you have to center native culture. because native ecosystems were a product of native culture, that they were maintained and sustained by native practices. And those are things that I, growing up with, and I think most of my ancestors had no awareness of. Even reading like Kelly Lytle Hernandez's book, City of Inmates, and the history of incarceration in the state of California, and especially Los Angeles. California incarcerates more people than any state in the union, and Los Angeles more people than anywhere else in the state of California. There's a 300-year history for that. And so part of that history is that when Europeans encountered indigenous people doing things like burning forests, they imprisoned them, or they moved them off their land, or they killed them. So this notion of erasure, this erasure of indigenous history has a lot to do with an erasure of an approach toward the land. They're inextricable. So, and I don't want to present myself as an authority on this subject. These are just the things I've come to understand. So that's where my mind is on that now. And I think it'll lead us, we can even segue into like erasure in general toward land, and this kind of tendency to keep even this now trend of like people get really into like, I want to do native gardens. And so they scrape everything off that they have and then want to put it in native. And it's like, wait, let's slow down and let's look at the land and let's tend to the land and let's see what it needs and what it wants and what we can do and what is performative environmentalism and an ecological action versus like truly beneficial ecological action. And so all these things are, and I don't mean to jump around, but I know that they're connected in my heart of hearts, that all of these things are connected, and I'm just trying to understand them. So that's when I talk about native, I'm talking about in a like a really boring sense, that which was there before the Industrial Revolution, those plants and those plant systems that were here, supporting the whole of the community, plants, animals, and people, but that were also being tended to by the indigenous communities, because without that, those systems would certainly have been very different systems, right?
So what would you say about, how do you restore the native ecosystems without the native cultures and the native peoples? I think we understand that is essential. This is the time that we're living in. And we know that this is the time for indigenous peoples to lead us back to that way. Yeah. And we are in that process. Who knows how long it will take, but we are in it now.
Sure. Yeah. And I think, wherever and whenever possible, when you're doing this work or when you're trying to invoke these practices, you have to bring in native culture and native people, and they have to be centered within the practice, period. That's sort of my short answer to it. Mm-hmm. Learning who those people are, like it takes doing some homework, and it takes reaching out to people. And I, you and I had gone back and forth before this conversation, just wanting to trade that information. The people that I've been working with here who are doing land restoration in a really cool, sort of radical way, have just been introducing me to different indigenous activists and indigenous land use people that are, it's all new to me. It's all new to me out here. And even back in Los Angeles, like I'm really just beginning to get to know people. I created a community garden in Eagle Rock, the Eagle Rock Presbyterian Church. And it was a 5,000 square foot lawn. And my kids were going to daycare there. And I was like, we have to do something about this. And so I just started doing it. And then I reached out to Nicholas Hummingbird, who I'd been listening to and reading, and he and I ended up sort of coming up with a plan for it together. And I, by and large, oversee the work, but Nick has helped me to understand how to heal that land. And he's worked on a couple different planning projects with me. That was just the beginning of that process of trying to understand how to do that from
an indigenous perspective.
Correct.
So what do you feel, when you just have come across about your roots and talking about being sort of a, I don't know what your ancestry is specifically, but as a, quote unquote, white European settler in this still largely settler colonial system, what do you feel is your responsibility because of that? I mean, everyone that lives here that is not indigenous has a certain responsibility to where we now live. And I wonder what you feel that is.
So when I started doing this, I had this jocular, like, hey, we can make our lawns wide. You know what I mean? I was like,
Right.
I've got a great idea. And then, of course, I realized a lot of people had this idea. And then, of course, and again, as you go down this rabbit hole, you realize, well, for hundreds of thousands of years, there were people it was endemic. It was tied into the way that they did things. And you and your people messed that all up. And that's a tough piece of medicine to swallow. But then more specifically to my own, history, when I started the Wild Yards Project, it was around 2017. And sort of what blew up all in the middle of that was Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And a lot of other things that put me into a very powerful state of listening. And so the first thing for me has been really to shut up and listen. I started out wanting to make media and wanted to be a person like talking to people. And then I was like, I'm not going to do that. I don't know enough. And I just really wanted to and want to listen. And so part of it is just trying to learn as much as I can about different BIPOC perspectives and to understand my own history, which, a long time ago, a friend of mine, an actor who's Black, he just said, you don't know your own history. And I was kind of like, what do you mean? And I didn't. And it's very powerful to me, the extent to which I didn't know my own history. And it's a little embarrassing. I became a dad late in life. I'm 60 years old. I got 2 little kids, and I'm embarrassed by how much I didn't know about my own European trajectory across the land, and even things like conservation and environmentalism, and how completely racist and violent those histories are. All these things, and it's not like these aren't like. When I started writing about this through the Wild Yards Project, I thought it'd just be like, hey, man, isn't this messed up? And the people are like, no, John Muir was a great man. And I'm like, you got to read, just read their own words, read Roosevelt's own words. Even Aldo Leopold was like, wow, we got it wrong. So, to me, it's been kind of flipping the script on a lot of things that are just fundamental beliefs in my culture and understanding really what was underneath those things. That's had a very powerful impact and a very meaningful impact how I approach anything now. Part of it is just to sort of presence myself to the space, to whatever the thing is I'm looking at, and then try to find a way to kind of like deconstruct or reverse engineer kind of how I got there, and then who perhaps I should bring into the conversation. And I'm sorry again, I don't know if I sound like I'm all over the place, but these are all the things that are kind of converging.
Well, I don't think you're alone in having these ruminations. I think there's plenty of people who are addressing the histories, discovering more of the histories, and then finding out what is our responsibility to this world and future generations, and how we go about doing restoration work. I think Robin Wall Kimmerer, she has an excellent video talking about the difference between sort of, kind of like almost this colonial ecosystem restoration approach. And then there's also indigenous way of restoration and relationship. So much of restoration kind of becomes like kind of an idea of management, or it's academic, or then it becomes like this botanical science, and it's still removed. Right. Have that aspect of family or ancestor or relative. Right. It doesn't have that kind of consciousness in it. And that's just because people come from where they are. They come from what they know. And most people do not know that kind of level of connection.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of cues up a conversation that, you and I sort of started prior to this, and that I really think now a great deal about, so I do consultation now, and I help people design and install native ecosystems wherever they live. And I'm doing that even here. I'm learning more and more about it where I am and on the North Shore of Massachusetts. And I'm working with a guy who is really anti-horticulture, and he comes from horticulture. He's heavily educated in that. I don't know if I want to call him out. Maybe I shouldn't pull in his name and his background, but he comes from a very powerful sense that the land is always trying to heal itself, even when it's using invasive plants to do, like, the land is doing something. Right. And so slow down, like, stop ripping things out. Like, erasure is how we got here. Right. Erasure is what we do. That's what European colonial mindset, the colonial mindset is, let me make it in my image. And so even if it's native, that can still be the same kind of traumatic and violent approach to the land. That's erasure, if you have. And so trying to kind of look at what's here and what's beneficial, what's as opposed to performative environmental ecological benefit. There's this kind of performative thing of like, I'm going to rip it all out and I'm going to put in indigenous plants, and
right, like this
as
native
opposed to like,
non-native conversation, or actually people war on the non-native plants.
right.
I think I
Right.
mentioned to you, we had Richard Bugby, a Payam Pachom elder, who's a long time ethnobotanist with 35 years, of continuous study with his mentor, his indigenous mentor. And, one of the things he said, we had this conversation and he had shared, my mentor would just say, if the plant is useful, we use it. We don't break it down to like native, that exists for them generations ago. So.
Yeah, I think this kind of like litmus test of purity, like all these things they're very, I don't know. I think the land is up to something. And so I think it's very important to kind of just still yourself and slow down and go like, how can I add and maybe not subtract? Like, what can I add that would make this more beneficial, and stop subtracting and stop erasing and starting over again. That my friend Nick calls it horticultural crime scenes, that lead to erasure. And it's just the next colonial movement.
A very segregated kind of way of going about restoration or planting a garden or cultivating.
Yeah. And so I think, invoking less and like just like committing less trauma on the land is a really important way to start. And then, do what you have to do to heal it from there. But, maybe listen and watch and slow down.
I think that's true of things like mustard. People war on mustard and they don't understand like what is mustard telling you about where the lands are in state of succession, like what's actually happening. And it's like, being able to read the signs of nature. Why is that growing there? And asking questions. I think that's so important to really understand what is the purpose of the plant being there? Because,
Right. And that, to me, and like, I rarely know, you know what I mean? Like, I don't come from science. I don't come from botany. Like, I really am I'm just like this dude. I'm just this dad. I'm just like, hey, I wanted to do this. But the process of just waiting and doing your homework, it becomes such a powerful educational tool. Like, you just learn a lot. You learn so much about your place and your history. And so that's part of the fun of it. I really had a lot of like anxiety about this whole conversation of indigeneity. And for a while, I was like, well, geez, maybe I shouldn't, because I'm a white guy, with all this baggage, maybe I shouldn't do anything. Maybe I should shut up. And Robin Wall Kimmerer sort of came to my rescue, with the whole, I'm going to quote her, if you don't mind.
Sure.
She said, for all of us, becoming indigenous to a place means living as if your children's future mattered, to take care of the land as if our lives, both material and spiritual, depended on it. And that has been a really beautiful tool to just sit there and go like, what do we need? What are we really trying to do? We're trying to amplify biodiversity. We're trying to make the earth more resilient. We're trying to also make it more just and more available to everybody. And that mindset, for me, I just find it's become a very powerful way of gauging what I do next and who I talk to next. You know what I mean?
Well, you describe yourself as a storyteller, and many of the collaborators at Wild Yards Project are also storytellers as well. And given the relationship of control, power, and narrative, why is diversity and storytelling so critical now?
Diversity in storytelling is essential because our understanding of the world without it is toxic and deadly. And so to me, it's like, if we're not centering the myriad other voices that have had, whether credited or not, a profound amount of positive impact on the whole state of humanity and the whole state of the planet, then without that, we're going to continue down the same path we've been down. And the same path that we've been down is clearly not working. The wheels are completely coming off the bus. The probably best way to answer that question is to sort of say where I'm at with that, because I stopped with the storytelling. In the sense that when I first started, I came out of making documentary television. I thought, I'm going to shoot a series on this, and I went, wait, like, there's too many voices and there's too many different people. And there's also too many filmmakers who aren't getting to make their films. And at the same time, I felt like I didn't have my hands in the dirt enough. I hadn't planted enough. I hadn't tried enough. I hadn't actually worked the land enough with enough different people to even be able to speak about it the way that I was.
Right.
And so at the height of all of this radical social change that's been happening, and I do think that as scary as things are right now, I also think there's been an extraordinary amount of growth. There's been an extraordinary explosion of storytellers and perspectives. And I think that we can't, we have to be careful not to lose hold of how much good has happened in terms of our listening and the voices that are being heard. But for me, I wanted to listen more and talk less.
Yes.
And I wanted to put plants in the ground. Now, now when I think about, generating this media, my goal is really to find a diverse group of filmmakers and to use them to then go out and meet in an anthology type sort of scenario, the diverse group of people who are working the land and healing the land and tell those stories. And that's something I haven't done prior. And that's my big goal. I have 3 things I'm really hoping to do right now. And that diverse filmmakers, diverse storytellers, telling the story of all the diverse members of our community who are doing their own version of this work.
David, we're going to take a break right now, and then we'll be back to talk more about diversity and storytelling.
Hey listeners, quick break here. We hope that you're enjoying EcoJustice Radio. We air every Monday at 9 a.m. on KPFT Houston and Wednesday at 3 p.m. on KPFK Los Angeles. Stay connected by subscribing to EcoJustice Radio on all major podcast apps and visit our website, ecojusticeradio.org, to check out previous shows and guests and get connected with us on social media. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon. Today, you are listening to the Wild Yards Project, transforming lawns into biodiverse habitats, with host Carrie Kim and guest David Newsom, founder of the Wild Yards Project.
Another aspect of the story, David, is we were talking about storytelling. One of my mentors, Stephen Jenkinson, talks about North American, this culture here, or settler colonial culture, is a demythologizing culture. It's not a culture that believes in story. And yet, in indigenous cultures, it is all story.
Right.
But the story is connection. And that's also how the intergenerational wisdom is passed on. So what do you feel about this need to actually revive stories? I mean, it is happening. You're talking about more and more storytellers have come. There's more and more perspectives that are accessible now and being seen now.
Well, I mean, I could talk about it from a bunch of different perspectives because I come from film and television. My wife actually runs a show for Apple called Little America, which is all about the stories of people from all over the world who've come to the United States over the last 30 years and what that life looks like for them. And those stories are told by a diverse group of producers and directors and I love that whole idea that what colonialism has done is the demythologization. But what's very clear to me is that most of us, most of the people that I know are very removed from the land. They're very removed from the plants. They're very removed from all of it. They have no communication with it. And I don't seek to vilify anybody when I say that, because I was one of those people. As much as I hiked and biked and did all these things, I had no fluency with the California coastal sage scrub, with the chaparral and the oak woodland. I loved it all, but I had no fluency with it. And if you don't have a fluency with a thing, if you don't have an intimacy with that thing, then you're not going to take care of it. And you're not even going to understand that you could or you should. When you begin to connect with all these other cultures and all these other communities that do have that, and they do have that history, they either have it from where they came from or they have it historically here, then the land begins to come alive again. And we all need to have that. We all have to have that. And we have to begin to get back to understanding our role and how we got where we are and how we can move forward in a more powerful and connected way. And those cultures, those communities have that.
I think
but
that
I
I would
didn't.
call it like sacred reciprocity, because it's not only you talk about fluency, but to me, it's really reciprocity, because there's no actual engagement, like personally touching those plants, giving back to
Right.
plants. I mean, I think about how many of us, I live that existence just like you, being outdoors and so forth, but how much did I actually give back? How much did I actually relate on a very intimate, personal level with the plant world? And
Hmm.
I think there's so many people that they're on the take. We're on the take. We are a culture on the take.
Yeah.
It's not a giving and receiving. It's just take, and
Hmm.
it's there for me. And there's an entitlement. And that is where there's a break.
Yeah. Extractive. We're just very extractive culture. What's funny is I was with a friend. I gave a talk here, on the North Shore in Gloucester a little while ago, and I went out with some friends afterwards. And one of the women is a historian by trade, and she's does amazing work creating native meadows and things like that. And she said, it's not like our ancestors were stupid, but it was they weren't stupid people, right? They're not dumb,
Right.
but the MO, the whole thing driving was extractive. It was like invent, take, create, overcome, manifest destiny, all these things, or the tabula rasa, like make the landscape your own, like, and build this thing. And
It's very egoic, anthropocentric.
yeah. And here we go. Here we are in 2022, and we get to go like, well, smart or not smart, that didn't work. It didn't work. It's a disaster. And that lack of intimacy with the land and that reciprocity and that kind of relationship and intimacy with all of it. It's funny because when I there's something else that Robin Walker wrote where she's like, talk to all of it. And I do. And my kids always make fun of me. I'm always like, hey, Rock, like I talk to everything.
I would think they talk to them too.
They do.
Kind of natural for kids to do that, right?
Yeah. That's a whole other conversation, especially with my kids. But that level of interaction with the land, I think it is who we are. I think it is who we all are. And I think that it was, culturally kind of like it was
Severed.
not
Severed.
Severed is exactly correct. That's the right way to put it.
We go back to all of our cultures, we will find that there was connection to the lands and to ancestors. And we have to go way, way back though.
Yeah.
To where the break began. I want to talk a little bit about property and ownership. We have been kind of dancing around this. And, you had mentioned after we deduct like all the lands that are designated as farmland and also suburban and urban development, maybe 4% of wild space left. I don't know if you're counting also lands that are belonging to indigenous sovereign nations here, but it seems that the fundamental problem we face is one of value. What do we value? Native cultures did not believe in profiting off the land,
right?
Sell the land, that you could own the land. But how do we change this concept of land ownership? Because it's deeply ingrained. Even people who are maybe decry the system are still profiting off of it. They'll take that appreciation value on their property. They'll take it. And so there's that is really, I think each individual has to really see, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And what are we willing to give up to
Right.
have that better world that we actually know is possible, to have a connected world that was what existed here?
Yeah. Well, my dim-witted blurt is, I don't know.
It's okay not to know the way forward. I think it's something that we all need to ruminate on. I think the question is in some ways even more important than the answer, because we just don't really know. We're at a different pivotal time right now to make different decisions. The pandemic was a big help in that.
Yeah, I think it was. And I think, look, if you look at like, again, for me, it's been really important for me to understand how everything that led us to where we are in terms of colonial sort of advancement from the East to the West was all about land ownership. So it was either about enslavement, incarceration or eradication. And as it pertained to cultures, as it pertained to to people, as it pertained to wildlife. I mean, everything. If you look at our policies with the national parks, it was all about making the white body more supple because we had conquered the West. And, Roosevelt and Muir were afraid that the white man would get too soft. So they wanted to make places for them to practice their hunting in. So they wanted to eradicate wolves and coyotes and bears and mountain lion. And and every indigenous tribe that lived on those lands. And so it was always about ownership. It's always been about ownership. And then whatever it took to manipulate the other cultures to make that more possible. So obviously it's inherent, this notion of land ownership is an inherent toxic expression of that history and of that culture. And at the same time, but now if I look where we are now, what's the answer to that? I certainly don't have an answer to that. I do know that I think reparations and land back are essential. Mm-hmm. And the land back movement is something that I believe very strongly in, and reparation movements and things like policies, I think, are all things that have to get like a major go ahead and need a great deal of attention, and they need to happen now. Like acknowledgement is one I think of right off the top of my head. But there's also Black Land Matters. If you look at the work that Duran Shapps is doing in Virginia, just the whole notion of black farmers and Black owned farms, all of these things, that
was all deliberate, right? It was to prevent that kind of ownership of land or having farmers who were Black. Farms. I mean, and also disenfranchisement and and making from the redlining of districts and all those kind of things, like devaluation of what they did own, and these are all really dark and not so in the distant future sort of expressions of colonial behavior on the land. And so the first thing that's got to happen is that if, as we all know, ownership matters. I don't know how to make it not matter. But I do know that then everyone's got skin in the game, and everybody deserves a fair share of it. One of the things I think about all the time, and this is, I don't know, maybe this is like a different, when I think about with the Wild Yards Project, I was like, well, who gets a garden? You know what I mean? Like, who gets a garden, and yet who's most impacted by what happens when we don't treat the land and heal the land. And so one of the things I really think is important is that in Los Angeles, the school district has to we have to have native garden programs, curriculums in every school, and every kid, regardless of where they live in that city and whether they have at home a yard or not, has to have access to native ecosystems, and understanding how those native ecosystems can help them understand everything that's happening in the world. Because as far as I'm concerned, you can learn almost anything you need to know about what's happening in the world by tending to a native ecosystem, because everybody's got skin in the game, and yet so many people are kept out of the conversation. Right. Well, I think also there's a lot of movement happening around traditional ecological knowledge being taught in schools too. I mean, schools have definitely had some very great challenges through the pandemic, and what's being taught and what is actually of value for the children to learn. So, that I'm sure is going to continue to change, and hopefully for the better. I mean, a lot more people are homeschooling their children. There's many, many different options. There's not one option anymore.
Yep.
And I wanted to shift a little bit to this word wild and what it means when we say, something is wild, and then going back through the history of why, whether it was during missionization or wild was something to fear.
Sure. Yeah. Wild actually.
And it still kind of remains like such in maybe this culture and people, that's why people are still kind of, they like the sterile lawn. They don't want critters in their lawn. They don't want the light. They don't want the thing torn up by skunks or whatever critters might be on the lawn. They want it to be this sterile, very tidy situation. Yeah. That's
control.
It's control. So how do you envision that, like kind of breaking that dominion over nature? It's so important, but I think it's about starting with the youth.
Right.
Because the more connected they are, the less they need to control it. The less the more you need to control it. Because it's wild.
The thing that and it's funny because some people, actually Nick Hummingbird wrote a whole thing about wild the other day, and how he thought it was it's a word that it can be derogatory, because it implies a non-civility. It was a thing that was used against indigenous people, and it's kind of used. It's always it was used, always in a derogatory way, or in a way that was kind of the noble savage, like a kind of like lurid romanticism or something like that. I named my thing what I did when I was where I was at. And I don't know, maybe someday the name of the thing will change. But what I think is just as interesting is the back half of what you were saying, which is that people have they don't like an unkempt space. Their whole,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think people have been educated to believe, they've been trained to believe that a certain thing is pretty. Ben Vogt, who's a prairie sort of, he's a wonderful writer. He has his first book is called A New Garden Ethic, and he uses the word that basically talks about creating native landscapes that are defiant, gardens of defiant compassion. Right? Gardens of defiant compassion, and the defiant part is the part that says, it throws the finger to the neighbors and says, rethink pretty, because what you have is not natural. It doesn't support life. It's sterile, and you've been sold a bill of goods for a couple hundred years, and you just need to get off the sauce. You need to start to understand what a natural system is, and understand why amplifying biodiversity is also sequestering carbon, and it's infiltrating water, and it's more just, and
just to understand nature in general, how nature, more of a curiosity, like a Taoist or a naturalist or an animist, in that way of just observing. We don't have to have the terminology for it, but just watch and observe. Watch how the water absorbs into your soil or your dirt, whatever you have. These are the things people are not observing,
No, because no one has been encouraged to. We're not culturally encouraged to observe and participate in the land. That there's no value. There's no currency in that. That's for someone to come and do the same. It's the same mentality of someone's going to do your roof or do your plumbing. They're going to work on your car. They're going to do your lawn. It's all just
that's the separation, right?
Mm-hmm. It's giant separation, and that it's to the lifestyle section. It basically is decorative. And that whole idea, what I do think we have now, unfortunately, is we're seeing the impact of climate change, and we're seeing the impacts of this loss of biodiversity. We're seeing the impact of basically not sequestering carbon, and so that gives you a portal of entry to say, okay, why is that happening? Why is that happening? And what can we do right where we live? And what I try to do that I think is very important, because it's really, you can get into Sturm and Drang, and you can easily, get into doom scrolling and going it's all, the wheels are coming off the bus and things are horrific and things are scary and things are going to get scarier, I think. But you do have agency, right? Everyone has agency, and part of that agency demands a kind of a shift in perspective. And the shift in perspective is what I think I can help with, is just to give you a moment to go okay, but look at where we are, look at what scares you, and then look at what you can do about it right where you are, regardless of who you are. And then I feel like my job is to think about how we can do that better. And with,
David, thank you so much for the work of the Wild Yards Project. I know it is an evolutionary project and endeavor that you have with all of your contributors there. And I wish you could share the links. How can people stay in contact with what you're doing, the events, the education piece, whatever it is that you have to share as it continues to grow and evolve, for people to definitely be more connected to the lands and to restore habitats, bring back all of the flora and the fauna that we can. So please share.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the best way to have a conversation with me, and to me, that's really what this is. It's a conversation. I work with people all over the United States, and they bring information to me and they correct me. And, it's an ongoing and evolving conversation. So the Wild Yards Project at Instagram is my most active place that I work from. I have a website that's in need of radical revision, but it's there. And there's some resources and tools there, and that's all going to get rebuilt fairly soon. And there's a Facebook group, Wild Yards Project. Me and Facebook had a bit of a divorce a while back. I found it to be a very toxic space, but the site isn't. The Wild Yards Project group is not. But the Wild Yards Project Instagram is really where I do most of my kind of dynamic interaction with people. And we have a community garden here in Eagle Rock that I'm really excited about. And we run workshops out of that. And anybody who wants to volunteer, get involved, can make with me. And then I do a national outreach and I give talks all over the country, and kind of meeting people where they're at to figure out how we can keep the work happening and expanding.
David, thank you so much for the work that the Wild Yards Project is doing. I mean, we are in this question. Many of us are pondering this, and the important thing is just to begin where we are, do the best that we can and connect with others who have similar, the same vision for a better world for our children and for the planet. So thank you so much for being.
Thank you. I'm really glad we met. I'm really looking forward to collaborating on the land.
Yeah. With their hands dirty. It's perfect.
Yeah, it was perfect.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you to our guest, David Newsom. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been the Wild Yards Project, transforming lawns into biodiverse habitats. For extended versions of our interviews, become a member of our Patreon. Please connect with us on social media at EcoJustice Radio, SoCal 350, and Adventures in Waste. If you like what you heard today and you want others to be informed, you know what to do. Subscribe to our podcast, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a donation to the show. You've been listening to EcoJustice Radio, a project of SoCal 350. The show can be heard on kpfk.org, kpft.org, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Created by Mark and JP Morris, executive producer Jack Eit, producer and co-host Jessica Aldridge, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.